Are you searching for a deeper understanding of your faith?
Inspiring Philosophy is your go-to resource for exploring the rich tapestry of Christian thought.
From biblical archaeology to philosophy of mind, we dive into the topics that matter.
Our content bridges faith and understanding, offering insights into God's existence and the reliability of the New Testament.
Join a community where faith meets reason and discover the answers you've been seeking.
Inspiring Philosophy, where faith meets understanding. Welcome, everyone. I am super excited for this stream. I have two amazing scholars with me here today, David Schreiner and Drew Holland. How are you both doing today?
I'm doing great. Thanks, Michael, for having me on.
Oh, yeah.
Yep, doing well. Thanks for having us.
So what are we doing here today? So there is a very interesting passage in the Bible where a lot of scholars argue it is evidence that God of Israel, Yahweh, lost to the Moabite deity Chemosh. And I had wrestled with this passage for a while. And then one day I was researching it and I came across a paper just by accident by Professor Holland here. And I was like, oh, good. I'm reading papers on this. I read like 3 or 4, like stuff in books and individual papers. And then I read yours and I was like, well, this just makes some darn tootin' good sense, as you guys say down in Mississippi. And I was like, there we go. This is what seems to be the case. So I did a video on it. Professor Schreiner here contacted me and was like, hey, I like that view too. So we started talking about it. And so, but there are other people that are still talking about this passage, like the scholar Dan McClellan, who we're going to be responding to today, who says this is a passage where Yahweh is defeated by another God. So that's what we're going to be going through today. So welcome, both of you. I'm super excited to have you guys on here. Go anything you want to say, promote, throw anything out there. Why don't you go first, David, and then you, Drew?
Great to be here. This is my 3rd time, I think, with you, Michael. And so it's always good to be on, and always a good time and fun conversation, those types of things. I don't think I have anything to plug. I do have I will say I do have a book that just came out. Drew's got one coming out too, so he's got one he can plug for you too. My book is a little different than the stuff I normally do, but it's called Frigate Birds, Sea Lions, and Darwin. And it was a book I wrote on some musings about creation, evolution, and ecology based on some family trips that my family has taken in the past few years to the Galapagos Islands. So.
Oh, nice. That's cool. Excellent.
Yeah.
So how about you, Drew?
Well, thanks, Michael, again for having me on. So it's just great to be here. And I guess if I've got to plug something, I've got a book coming out later this year called The Place of the Past, Historical Criticism's Role in Biblical Studies. Last couple of years, I've delved into the philosophy of history. And as historical critics of the Bible, which David and I both are, there's not a lot out there to give some philosophical underpinnings to why it's legitimate to study the Bible historically. There's kind of a split really in our guild of reading the Bible as literature or reading the Bible historically, and so I really try to mend that chasm in my work that I've got coming up. So thanks for giving me a chance to plug that.
Oh yeah, for sure. Yeah, happy to have you both here. So I'm going to put the passage up here. So this is, of course, like my pastor, for example, said like he didn't know what to do with this passage. So I'll just recap it here. Okay, so basically, in a nutshell, Moab rebels. Moab is a vassal of the kingdom of Israel. So Israel gathers the Judahites, the Edomites, and they decide to make war on Moab. Elisha, the prophet, meets them, and he says, yeah, you'll get victory. So there's a great battle. The Moabites get defeated, and then the Israelites start taking every single town. So they take every major city. They get to the capital, and then we get to the end here, the enigmatic ending. And it says, but when they came to the camp of Israel, the Israelites rose up and struck the Moabites so that they fled from them, and the Israelites invaded the land, killing the Moabites. So they destroyed the cities, and each one threw a stone on every plot of good land and filled it. So they stopped up every spring of water and cut down every good tree until in Kir Hareses, hope I pronounced that right, only they left its stones. However, the rock slingers surrounded it and struck it. When the king of Moab saw that the battle was too fierce for him, he took with him 700 men who drew swords to break through the king of Edom, but they could not. Then the king of Moab took his oldest son, who was to reign in his place, and offered him as a burnt offering on the wall. And great anger came upon Israel, and they departed from him and returned to their own land. And we hear that, and we're like, wait, what just happened? Like, it's like this big, long, epic passage, and all of a sudden, and then he said his son, and Israel lost the end. Anyway, moving on, like real quick. So it's brief. And so a lot of people have looked at this and was like, well, what happened? Well, Mesha, the king, sacrificed his son, invoking his deity, Chemosh. Chemosh came down with this great wrath or this great anger and drove Israel out of the land. And that would mean that Yahweh was defeated because through Elisha the prophet, he said he would give them victory. So when I read Drew's paper, and David Schreiner endorses it as well in his book that he wrote with Kyle Greenwood, Ahab's House of Horrors, you have a very interesting approach to this where you build off the great scholar Raymond Westbrook, which is that, well, we think, and you can correct me if I'm wrong if I misrepresent anything, but we think that this is what Mesha is doing, but that seems to be a cultural misunderstanding. This passage is brief, sure, so it's hard to really know for sure, but we see in the ancient Near East and the southern Levant, sacrifices were not done to sort of like turn the tide of a battle, but were done as acts of atonement. And you cited a bunch of other places in the Hebrew Bible to support this. So in verse 26, that's the key verse here. The king, Mesha, could not break through. Therefore, he basically accepted defeat. And as now an act of atonement for rebelling against Israel and being defeated, he sacrifices his son to atone for that sin of rebelling. But that would mean Israel is participating in this human sacrifice. They're up there. Yeah, this is, you better do this. This is your way of atoning, and this will guarantee your son won't rebel in the future. And that's, of course, going to piss God off, and he's going to now unleash his great wrath and drive Israel out for them participating in this horrid human sacrifice. Is that a good representation, or did I get something wrong?
No, I think you nailed it. There's a lot in this whole chapter. I mean, the first big question that you have to wrestle with is Elisha's prophecy fulfilled? Does it actually come true? And some say that technically, yes, it does. And then this sacrifice of Mesha's son happens and they go away. Others say that no, this is actually an example of the lying spirit or deceitful spirit, which you also see with Micaiah ben Imlah in 1 Kings 22. And there are some similarities between 1 Kings 22 and 2 Kings 3. But I'm of the camp that, yes, first, I do think Elisha's prophecy comes true to the letter. Everything that Elisha says will happen, does happen. It seems at Kir Hareseth that maybe there's some wiggle room, like maybe the wall wasn't destroyed by the slingers. But I try to argue that actually slingers, this was their job in ancient warfare, is they destroyed walls. And the verb that's used there in Hebrew, nakah, struck, actually indicates destruction. So yes, that happened. So having established that, you really have to, and what I try to do in my paper is I try to use the the worldview of the Bible, right? I'm trying to use lexemes, study lexemes from the Bible and concepts from the Bible, because there's a lot of other interpretations from this. We'll try to pull from, say, like, what's child sacrifice look like in the ancient Near East? And our view has changed on that pretty dramatically. We don't think there actually was a lot of child sacrifice, and we can't really compare what's happening in Moab to what happened, say, in Phoenicia or wherever, or Punic colonies, which is usually where we have that evidence for. So what I try to do is, again, just look at what's going on, because you kind of have to fill in some gaps. You really do. In Professor McClellan's video, he notes that, well, it's pretty simple what happened, right? But it's really not. I mean, the text is ambiguous, and I think it's kind of ambiguous for a reason. And so in my paper, I look up some of these different concepts and what's going on. For instance, this is not a general sacrifice. This is not just any old sacrifice that Mesha is making here. This is an olah, a whole burnt offering, which is a particular kind of sacrifice. And if you look throughout the Hebrew Bible, you do find several instances where an olah is offered in the context of a battle. And it's usually offered for the loser for contrition, either to God or whomever, or even, the suzerain who's over the vassal. Or it could be, if you're the victor, it could be celebration to God. So it can be an olah, a whole burnt offering, can be done many different ways. And that olah is often, it is very specific. It requires a firstborn. Now, for Israel, it wouldn't be a firstborn child. It would be a firstborn lamb or some kind of animal. But in Moab, it may have required a child. We don't know. So just looking at that, I mean, just trying to look at what an olah does in a warfare context. Also, you have who is this to? It doesn't say who this sacrifice is offered to. Is it offered to Chemosh? Is it offered to Yahweh? Who's the recipient of this whole burnt offering? That's ambiguous, as is the great wrath, or I think your translation said great anger. Yeah. And so you kind of have to dig and say, what is the great wrath or the great anger? And Professor McClellan's view is that, well, this is the lone instance in the Hebrew Bible where the wrath is from a God, because, and I know I'm sympathetic to this view that he has, that they're on Chemosh's home court, right? This is in the ancient world, you have chthonic deities that are centered around, they have land, right? They have territory, and the Hebrew Bible, it will say, this is the land of such and such God. But one thing an issue I have with Professor McClellan's video is that, he brings up the Exodus, and that, you could say this happened in the Exodus where Yahweh actually acts in a foreign land. But he very quickly, and I know he doesn't have time in a quick video to give his whole explanation as to why that's not historical and we don't need to buy into it. But for one, it's still in the Bible. It's still a literary thing that we have to reckon with. But two, I mean, you also have other examples like, say, Samson in the land of the Philistines. Yeah. Yahweh works there too. So I think Yahweh can work in these other places. So who is this great wrath? Is it Chemosh? Is it Yahweh? And it's not just wrath, it's great wrath. And when you look up this term, great wrath, what do you know? You find it in Deuteronomy 29:27, that God will have great wrath if you have, if you're worshiping other gods, if you're following false gods. It also occurs in 21:5 of Jeremiah, Zechariah 7:12. So this phrase, great wrath, I mean, I think just if you're looking at the Bible, I don't think you can say, well, this is just a one-off. No, in the Bible, great wrath seems to happen from Yahweh towards his people when there is a cultic misdeed. So why all the ambiguity then? Why doesn't the author just come out and say this is a certain sacrifice to a particular God? Because I think, remember, Moab and Israel, they're on a similar family tree, right? They're very close. Right. They have origins together in Genesis. And so they probably have pretty common worldview. So if you are the Moabites offering this sacrifice, you could say you're offering this olah, this whole burnt offering, as an act of contrition after the battle. And if you are Israel, you're offering it to your God for victory. And so that's perhaps why there is an ambiguous recipient of the sacrifice. Now, I think the great wrath, I think that's just something you have to look at the rest of the Bible and say, okay, great wrath. Of course, this is Yahweh. This is the Hebrew Bible. This is the God that we're acknowledging. And also I want to mention there's a practical application of this too. Why the sacrifice of Mesha's son would be very practical, because this would get rid of the next generation who would seek vengeance against the Israelites for ruling. And it's a very practical warfare tactic. And also, again, the Olah, the whole burnt offering, occurs. It's always of a firstborn. He's the firstborn son as a substitute for the offender or the people. So, all of these different factors kind of combine for me to say, okay, this is not maybe what it looks like on the surface. And I think Raymond Westbrook is one of those who's kind of gotten on the right track with this. And so I kind of build off of some of his arguments. So thank you for mentioning him.
Yeah. Great summary. David, you had earlier, we had talked about this, like Dan McClellan is sort of saying like, this is like the only rational way, that this is a Chemosh being defeated. And like, what are your thoughts on that there?
Yeah, I think, look, as Drew alluded to, I think I do have a little bit of sympathy with McClellan's position on this. I do think in the video, McClellan does say that this is a highly embarrassing episode. And I do think that there's part of that. But I think that he pigeonholes himself a little bit, and he presents the passage as if, as we've already alluded to, this is the obvious answer here. But when we start to dig a little bit and you start to recognize that there is a fair amount of ambiguity in the passage, you begin to realize that there's something deeper going on. And I think what Drew has mentioned about the ambiguity in the passage, I think that's actually part of something greater than just this passage. In other words, there's ambiguity. I think that there's ambiguity in this passage because this passage is supposed to be read alongside a couple other chapters very close by, and they're working together as a unit. And this is what, and this is kind of where Kyle and I developed Drew's work in our book, Ahab's House of Horrors. I do think that this is a part of a larger methodological critique of the Omride dynasty. And that's one of the reasons why there's an intentional ambiguity here, is because they want certain things to kind of bubble to the surface, not so much focus upon individual people, but rather institutions, not so much focus on individual particular actions, but also look at the general way that they operated, because all of this is falling under criticism. This is all a part of a larger critique. And so to suggest, though, that as the video does, that this is kind of a chapter in isolation, I think misses the point, because I think this is a part of something larger. And when you start to look at the ambiguity and see that it's probably a part of something larger, then you realize that there's something more going on here. And this is a part of something larger. And there's other explanations to this. As we've already alluded to, that when we start digging below the surface, it may not be as straightforward as we necessarily think.
Yeah. So you got your book there. It's a great book. We went over it in an earlier live stream. David's been on twice. Once we went over the book and the early Inscription. In another stream, I don't know if you know this, Drew, I had David on to be totally blindsided. We were going to give him Islamic arguments that Muhammad is mentioned in the Hebrew Bible. And he just like, my favorite part of that stream, David, is like in the beginning, you're trying to be nice. Like, okay, yeah, this is clearly wrong. And by the end, we're like, let's bring up Psalm 84. And you're like, no, that's dumb. This is dumb. What are they talking about? Like, it's amazing. I absolutely loved it. So awesome. So, all right. If you guys have any super chats for these two amazing scholars who have a wealth of knowledge about the Hebrew Bible, get them in now. We'll go over them in a little bit. There's already a couple in there we can get to, but let's get into this video a little bit here. This is Dan McClellan arguing that in 2 Kings 3, Yahweh loses the Chemosh. So whenever you guys are ready to respond to something, just say something. I'll stop, and then we'll respond and just keep going through it. So yeah, whenever you guys are ready, just say stop here, and I'll stop, and we'll respond.
The story is found in 2 Kings chapter 3. And this chapter begins by talking about the death of the Israelite king Ahab. And when this happened, one of the nations that had been paying tribute to Israel, that had been a vassal state to Israel, namely Moab, decided they were going to throw off vassalage, refused to pay the tribute. And so the new Israelite king, Jehoram, decides to put together a coalition of Israel, of Judah, and Edom, and go in and try to either restore Moab to vassalage or just completely subdue and try to destroy Moab. And this is kind of the scorched earth campaign that the Assyrians would engage in. In fact, there's a pretty good parallel to our story later on in 2 Kings chapters 18 and 19, which is also discussed in the book of Isaiah, where Sennacherib tries to invade Judah after Hezekiah throws off vassalage. And what happens to Sennacherib? Well, he's run off after the angel of Adonai kills 185,000 Assyrian troops. So he invades the other.
Go ahead and pause it real quick.
Yeah, go for it.
Yeah, so this kind of speaks to one, the connection that he makes between 2 Kings 18 and 19 and this kind of group of text. Kyle Greenwood and I actually we also make this connection, and we talk about that as well. So I am sympathetic to that. But it is important, and this speaks to my comment about that this passage is a part of something larger. Notice how he talks about this suzerain vassal relationship and how Moab was under vassalage to Israel, and Ahab has died, and there's a political transition. This is automatically setting the stage, and this is what Drew is getting at the end of his paper when he starts talking about the type of sacrifice. This isn't just some random interaction or some random conflict. This is a conflict that has a very distinct context for it and a very distinct rationale behind it. And this is all feeding into what actually is going on here. So we can't just, read quickly in these passages and get to the end where all the neat stuff is that we can talk about. All of this stuff is building up to that moment. And it's a very important variable that shows us imperial methods are being targeted here. Imperial methods are maybe not are being targeted. It's not the best way to put it, but imperial methods are the context behind what is going on. And so all of this is going to come together, and it's a very important variable that we consider when we start to try to make sense of this.
Yeah, and let me add too, I mentioned the 2 Kings 18 episode with Hezekiah and Sennacherib. To me, the close parallel here is not the end of that story when the Assyrian army flees, but actually at the beginning. So if you look at 2 Kings 18, 13 and 14, Hezekiah rebels against Sennacherib. And King Hezekiah of Judah sent to the king of Assyria at Lachish, saying, "I've done wrong. Withdraw from me. Whatever you impose on me, I will bear." And so there is a tribute payment, and that's really the model of what we're looking at here, where we have a vassal who rebels against the suzerain. The suzerain can't, or the vassal can't withhold against the suzerain, and he apologizes. Right? In this case, there's a tribute payment. But my argument is that what's going on in 2 Kings 3 is, instead of a tribute payment, we have a whole burnt offering.
Yeah, and you make that case in your paper here. I believe it's on page 16 that this is similar to what we see in 2 Kings 3. It's with this incident in 2 Kings 18. King Hezekiah apologizes and offers to repay the damage that has been caused. Mesha is probably doing something similar. I've done wrong, Israel, and I can't defeat. I didn't break through, like 2 Kings 3:26 says. So what does he do? He offers his sacrifice of his firstborn son to atone for that. And so the actual parallel, I think, 2 Kings 18 that Dan McClellan brings up, I think actually works better for the case we're making here, not this other case. So I thought that was interesting that he brought that up there. So.
Yeah, and that's from Raymond Westbrook too. I mean, he's the one who really identifies that.
Yeah, Raymond Westbrook is a beast for sure in scholarship, as we say here among the lay people.
Absolutely. But here in our story, the first attempt to invade Moab goes horribly, and they have to regroup and retreat back to Israel. And then Jehoshaphat, the king of Judah, says, "Don't we have any prophets we can talk to who are devoted to Adonai?" And they bring out Elisha. And Elisha gives them instructions on what they're going to do, and has Adonai promise I will give Moab into your hands, which is a promise of unconditional unilateral victory over the nation of Moab. And so,
Drew, what do you think about this comment right here with the unconditional unilateral? What do you think of that?
Yeah, I mean, I don't know. Yeah, like I said, I think Elisha's prophecy comes true, right? I mean, I think there is victory, but yeah, I mean, he tries to break through and he doesn't. So there's victory. I mean, maybe in those certain terms, I don't know, but in terms of
I thought this was a situation where I thought he oversimplifies the nature of prophetic speech.
Yeah.
And this is this was the first moment that I'll admit that I don't dislike everything about this video. There are actually parts of this video that I can sympathize with, but this was one moment where I was like, nah, I think you're oversimplifying things a little bit, because these statements, their oath formulas, their condition, their oath formulas in Hebrew are a really complex thing, and very few people study them because they're so daggum difficult. I mean, that's just the harsh reality of it. And to suggest that this is a clear unconditional statement is skirting with an oversimplification of the nature of oath formulas, particularly in these types of contexts. And so that was kind of a red flag moment for me. It wasn't the biggest discrepancy I had with this video, but it was one that kind of piqued a red flag for me to kind of say, we probably should go back and think about that one for a little bit more.
Yeah, good point.
Can you explain that a little bit more for us stupid people? Like, so what is difficult here? What is being oversimplified?
Well, it's just the nature of and the way oath formulas operate in Hebrew, particularly, because a lot of times you'll only get half of the actual oath formula. And, oath formulas are a lot of times I'll do this if you do this or something along those lines. They're almost like conditional. They're almost like conditional statements. They're very closely related to conditional statements in Hebrew.
I see.
And the difficulty with oath formulas is a lot of times in the Hebrew, you only get half of it. The English translations in some instances will actually add part of the oath formula to the original text, just because without it, it makes very little sense in English.
I see.
And so that's why I say oath formulas are not necessarily as straightforward as we tend to think, because of the way that they're articulated, particularly within Hebrew.
I see. That makes sense. Okay. So now I see what you're getting at there. All right. Yeah. Interesting. Yeah. So, yeah, I see what you mean now and what he said there. This is why I enjoy talking to scholars, filling a lot of gaps for us here.
Again, and this time everything's going to plan. And I want to talk about the last 3 verses here. In verse 25, the cities they overturned, and on every good piece of land, everyone threw a stone until it was covered. Every spring of water they stopped up, and every good tree they felled. Only at Kir Hareset did the stone walls remain until the slingers surrounded and attacked it. When the king of Moab saw that the battle was going against him, he took with him 700 swordsmen to break through opposite the king of Edom, but they could not. Then he took his firstborn son, who was to succeed him, and offered him as a burnt offering on.
Yeah, go ahead.
So I did just come across an interesting interpretation of this. I really came across a couple years ago and then revisited it recently. But there is a rabbinic interpretation that was picked up by Sacred Bridge guy, David,
Anson Rainey?
Anson Rainey, yeah. And he supports this reading that actually the Edomites are really the important people here. And actually what's happening is when Mesha and his army go up to the king of Edom there in verse 26, they end up taking the firstborn son of the Edomite king and then sacrificing him. So it's his. And now, to me, that doesn't work. I mean, well, it's possible, but I don't like it because there's not a disjunctive in verse 27, which you would usually expect when there's a turn of events in Hebrew. But it could be because, I mean, quite literally, it's he took his firstborn son. Okay, who's the he? Well, maybe Mesha, but who's his firstborn son? Maybe it's the king of Edom, because that is the last proper noun we've seen that could modify that. His firstborn. It's possible. Anyways, I just thought I'd throw that in there as an alternative. I don't buy it, but it's an interesting reading.
Yeah. Well, I heard one recently. Let me put the passage back up here just to get your guys' thoughts on it, which is that Elijah tells them to overthrow every city. So where is it here? So you shall strike every fortified city and every choice city. And I think what I heard, and I forget where I heard this, but it says that when they got to the capital, they left the stone, so they didn't really overthrow it. And only the rock slingers surrounded it and struck it, which could be another violation of what God has commanded. So now this is what I find interesting about this, is that this is so vague, and there are so many interpretations of this passage. For Dan McClellan to say, like, well, it's just obviously this, I just think is not being fair to a lot of the scholarship on this.
Yeah, and that's part of the sensationalist aspects to his presentation. I mean, you know this, Michael. Drew and I talk about this all the time. I mean, this is what they thrive on. And this is the problem here. I mean, you on the one hand, how much of a sophisticated, nuanced argument can you make in a 7-minute TikTok video? But this is a passage that requires a nuanced argument, because there's a lot of ambiguity, because there's a lot of stuff going on, and there's a lot of places where interpretations. And so to present it as if, well, this is obvious. Okay, dummies, how can you not see this? It's a bit, that's a bit problematic.
No, and as I said, I mean, this has been a debate from the rabbinic period on, and yeah, I don't necessarily buy the simplicity of it.
Yeah, totally get where you're coming from there.
On the wall. And great wrath came upon Israel, so they withdrew from him and returned to their own land. So this seems to describe Israel's retreat without having conquered Moab or even killed their king. And we know from historical data that Moab was independent from then on. And so the attempt either to return Moab to vassalage or to destroy Moab failed. Why? Well, it has something to do with this sacrificing of his son and heir on the city wall. The very next words are, great wrath came upon Israel. And the word there, ketzef, for wrath, almost always refers specifically to divine wrath. Now, in the other uses of this term, it's a reference to Adonai's wrath against Israel or against others. But here it doesn't really make any sense why Adonai would suddenly chase off their own force after the king of Moab sacrificed his son on the city wall. There's
real quick with this section, the word for divine wrath, he kind of like a little ambiguous at first, but he says it's almost always a reference to Yahweh's wrath. But it's never used as a reference for wrath for another god, if I'm not mistaken there.
Not to my knowledge. And I remember doing a pretty in-depth word study when I was doing this. But yeah, I mean, I think, and this is the Hebrew Bible, right? This is written by God's people for God's people. And so to me, the subject would be implied, if anything. Yeah, and I'll just say also, he mentions and kind of going back to what you had said earlier, Michael, that the theory that maybe Elisha's prophecy was not fulfilled. Maybe this is an example of the lying spirit, because you have Kir Hareseth, that the stone walls remain. But again, in my argument, it's that no, actually the slingers, that's their job. They tear down city walls. That's what they do in ancient warfare. And so really, I think that's really kind of spelled out there in verse 25 for dramatic effect, that only at Kir Hareseth did the stone walls remain until the slingers surrounded and attacked it. And the Hebrew word there is nakah, which is one of those words that always means destroyed. So, yeah.
Yeah. And I mean, like, we've talked about this at the beginning, but there are plausible reasons, as you propose, that Yahweh would drive them out. If this is an atonement sacrifice that Mesha is performing, that's going to piss God off. He does not like human sacrifice. So of course he's all right. That's it. Like when I actually explained this to my pastor, and who's a really good analogy. He's like, it's sort of like a parent with kids. Like, all this chaos has happened, and it's like, all right, everyone stop. You go to your room. You go to your room. Everyone back to their own room. Right. I'm sick and tired of this. It's kind of like, just, all right, out of Israel. You've gone too far now. You don't get Moab.
Right. Yeah, and this I think fits in with, Dave was talking about the kind of larger complex of stories about the Omride dynasty. I mean, I think this is just yet another story that portrays the Omride dynasty as cultically wrong. I mean, they're just this is a dynasty that's portrayed in the Deuteronomistic history, in First and Second Kings, as a dynasty that is they're apostate, And this, to me, is just another example of that they're participating in the sacrifice with, post-victory with the Moabites.
Yeah.
No, but I actually think, and this is getting to where Kyle Greenwood and I get into this. This is almost like the perfect ending to this entire episode, because what begins in 1 Kings 20 and then is picked up again in 1 Kings 22, it comes to a culmination in this passage. And there are reasons why all these passages are linked together. They're textual reasons. There's an emphasis upon the king of these countries more than the actual names. So this is why they're elevating the institution. And when you realize that this sacrifice, yes, it's a human sacrifice, but it's even more than a human sacrifice. It's a sacrifice made out of contrition. So it's a contrite sacrifice because they have overstepped their bounds and they have rebelled as their vassal. And so it's trying to bring back into kind of a status quo this suzerain vassal relationship. And this is the criticism of the Omride dynasty. This is the message of these chapters altogether, is that they leveraged the spiritual vitality of not just themselves, but everybody else for the sake of political gain. In other words, the ends justified the means for them. And that's the whole thing that's being criticized here. So they'll go into these battles and they'll go into these conflicts knowing full well what they're supposed to do. They've heard the message of God. They've heard the prophet tell them what they're supposed to do. And they choose not to because they think that if they can just reconstruct the political relationship, then they can then continue to influence the region. So they're leveraging all of that against just being obedient. And that's the problem. And that's coming to a head here when you have Moab, who was their vassal. They've stepped out of line, they've rebelled, and they have them there to do what they're supposed to do. They have the word of God from the prophet Elisha, and they choose not to do it. They choose to engage in this whole olah, this whole burnt offering, which is a sacrifice that says, hey, we screwed up. Can we have another shot at it? That's the problem there. And so, yes, it is human sacrifice, but it's also this layering of the politics involved as well.
Yeah, I like what you say in your book here. So I brought this quote up. The wrath that descended upon Israel is indeed Yahwistic, caused by their partaking in an inappropriate sacrifice that was at the center of an attempt to repair a fractured political relationship. The scene describes the Israelite force as once again prioritizing political relationships over obedience to Yahweh and his desires. This is what incurs the wrath of Yahweh. Moreover, it's remarkably similar to the errors of Ahab at the end of 1 Kings 20 and further contributes to a pattern that persists throughout the historical record. So when we look at
whoever said that, that's exactly what I was trying to say. Whoever said that, that was great.
Yeah. It's just some nobodies I've never heard of. But anyway, yeah, it's like I think it's a great point you bring up, David, is that this is like this is one chapter in a much bigger picture, which is critiquing the Omride dynasty here. And if we look at it in that context, it doesn't make sense with Dan McClellan's interpretation. I'm not saying it's impossible, but it makes far more sense with what you guys are arguing here. And I think we need to look at it more holistically than as just this individual chapter that's been thrown into the mix of 2 Kings there. And so, yeah, I appreciate you bringing that up. All right, let's continue on here.
There's really only one good explanation for this that does not require we just gin up scenarios that are not in evidence. And
so if anybody has missed the point, that's the big point that we're trying to make. All right, this isn't the most obvious. What did he just say? I can't even remember. It just, but this isn't the most obvious, straightforward answer. There are other possibilities here that the frustration is that he's just skirting off, and ultimately there are possibilities that I think are these are explanations that are better.
We get this all the time from him. Like this is the only rational explanation is what I'm presenting.
Right. That's it.
And it's like, dude, this is such a brief passage. I'm not even saying Dan McClellan's interpretation is not rational. I'm not saying it's entirely wrong. I'm just saying it's least plausible given a lot of the evidence you guys have presented in your work. And when we look at it in full context, one of the things you bring up, Drew, in your paper is like, these are not Moabite authors. These are Israelite authors that were just authoring the fact that Solomon in 1 Kings was saying, like, there is no God greater than Yahweh. He's the only God. And so, like, are we really going to say, like, they're going to, like here are some passages, like 1 Kings 8:60, 2 Kings 5:15, 2 Kings 19. Or are they really going to say what they call the abomination of Moab? is going to be able to defeat this God, they're not going to interpret it that way, even if like that's the way the Moabites interpreted it. They're going to have their own theological ideas about what happened, and it's not going to be what this idea that Moab, the god of Moab, defeated Yahweh so easily and so quickly.
Right. Yeah. And later on, I guess we can get this when he talks about it, but he brings in the Moabite evidence, which we have from the Moabite stone.
Mm-hmm.
And I mean, this is, I mean, lots of ancient, I mean, almost all ancient literature is, it's rhetoric, it's polemical rhetoric for, your side, whether you're talking about the Hebrew Bible or the Moabite stone. You wouldn't expect some unbiased reporting, even if even the staunchest atheists could say. I mean, everyone's trying to make their own point, their own side. So, yeah, but I guess we can get to that when he mentions that.
Does not require we just gin up scenarios that are not in evidence, and that is that the sacrifice worked. It catalyzed the intervention of the Moabite patron deity Chemosh, who then drove off the invading forces and their deity. In this time period, every deity had their own national purview, their own territory over which they were supreme. But if you went into another deity's territory, you risked losing in battle because that deity was supreme in their territory. Not in every case. The story of the Exodus is an example of a story where Adonai goes into another nation to judge the
This
gods.
is a great example of using henotheism as kind of a trump card. Yes, no one's arguing that this isn't around, and the ancients didn't believe this, but this becomes a driving force in his interpretation, that this had to happen because of one thing in particular, henotheism.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and even like he's gonna let me finish what he's gonna say here, because he's gonna mention the Exodus here as like an example where Yahweh goes into Egypt and defeats them. But let's hear that, and then I'll say something.
Adonai goes into another nation to judge the gods of that nation and is successful. But it is also a story that is not supported by any historical data whatsoever, and so is likely a literary creation. This story.
So I mean, like,
that's an overstatement. That's one of the gross overstatements that many scholars in our fields make. It is just.
Yeah.
You could do, I mean, and I know you've done a ton of work on this, Michael. That is that is a gross generalization that comes out of, and that's not everybody's opinion.
Yeah.
Well, and even then, I mean, he says that the Exodus is a literary creation. What's to stop anyone from saying that 2 Kings 3 is also not a literary creation, because it's written down, it's literary, right? These are all in the same written volume. Why not treat them equally? But again, it's all going to argue. I think even the better parallels are within the Deuteronomistic history itself. Deuteronomy, the framework of Deuteronomy, Joshua, Judges, Samuel, Kings. So Exodus, I wouldn't even pick out as a
right. We've got, there's got to be look. I'm completely aware of the historical problems associated with the Exodus as an event. I'm not arguing that. But we've got to stop using that as some type of perceived trump card that helps us put our argument over the top. Like, just you got to put it to rest, man. You've got to stop.
Yeah, I think that's a good point. Like I've done a whole documentary with an Egyptologist, David Falk, on Exodus and all the evidence we have for it. We've got a ton of evidence. And I know even very liberal scholars that'll be like, okay, yeah, it wasn't like this big thing. There may have been like a small group, but there was still some historical kernel of truth there. And so like, there's that. But even if we didn't, like the author of 2 Kings, I think, would know of this Exodus story, and that would be in his background. So like, it's still something that's a literary story that would be there, that would be influencing this author's theology and his view of Yahweh at this point when he's writing this, which is pretty late. It's not like he's writing this right after the event happened. I think this is like exile or post-exilic work. Yeah. So yeah.
Well, that's a whole other.
That's a whole other.
I think it's pre-exilic, but that's just my crazy opinion. That's a different discussion for a different time. But
yeah, I think I remember reading Richard Elliott Freeman saying it was like Josiah and then someone in the exile up added the end to 2 Kings. But yeah, that's a whole nother. That's a whole nother
podcast for another day, I think. Yeah.
However, in Moab does seem to be historical. At least Israel's loss of Moab as a vassal state is historical. We have an inscription from this king of Moab, whose name was Mesha. This inscription is called the Mesha inscription, and it dates to the middle of the 9th century BCE. And here's the first part of the translation. I want to start at the very end of line 4. Omri was king of Israel, and he oppressed Moab for many days because Chemosh was angry with his country. This would refer to Moab's vassalage to Israel. His son succeeded him. This would be Jehoram. This is what is described in the beginning of 2 Kings 3. And he also said, I will oppress Moab. In my days, he said this. Why? Because Mesha threw off vassalage, and the king needed to make a point. But I prevailed over him and over his house, and Israel utterly perished forever. Now, that's obviously rhetorical exaggeration, but the idea here is that Mesha successfully threw off that vassalage and prevailed over Israel. And we have more discussion of this later on in the inscription, toward the middle of line 18. Now the king of Israel had built Yahatz, and he occupied it while he was fighting against me. So this is the invasion of Moab on the part of Israel. But Chemosh drove him out from before me. And so this attributes the expulsion of the invading force of Israel from Moab to the intervention of the Moabite patron deity Chemosh. So it is plausible that both Mesha as well as the author of 2 Kings 3 are accounting for the same historical event, namely Israel's failure to return Moab to subjugation to the intervention of the Moabite patron deity Chemosh. In other words, the God of Israel was out of their territory, lost home court advantage, was in the purview of another deity, and that deity routed them and drove them out. Now,
when I watch this, like I don't quite understand why the Mesha inscription was invoked here, other than that. I mean, it only works, and it's only a support for his argument if you buy into the interpretation that Chemosh is the deity that has the great wrath and the great anger and scurries everybody away. If that's not the interpretation of that phrase, which hopefully everybody understands that that's very, very debatable, then there's nothing wrong with the Mesha inscription, both in the sense that it's talking about the same general historical reality as the Bible. I don't know of anybody who argues against that. But to bring it in as evidence that this is in fact Chemosh, this is in fact Chemosh's great wrath in the Bible, that's a huge interpretive leap.
Yeah, I'm not sure why he thinks it's necessary that the writer of 2 Kings 3 sees that or shares that view with the author of the Moabite inscription. I mean, we would expect, again, these are all tendentious literary stories. I mean, the Moabite stone, we would expect it to come from a Moabite religious perspective in the same way that we would expect the Hebrew Bible to come from a Yahwistic perspective. And I don't think that doesn't necessitate any faith claims to make that statement. So.
Well, I like what you say in your paper, Drew. You say this means that the recipient of Mesha's sacrifice was not strictly Chemosh. Rather, even if the Moabites and Israelites had their respective gods in mind while sacrificing, the net result of their deeds was a worshipful action directed to an unknown God. The text reflects this syncretistic situation in its ambiguity. So yeah, I think we would completely agree that the Moabites saw this happening and go, yes, Chemosh came to save us. And the Israelite authors would have been like, that was Yahweh driving Israel out for this human sacrifice issue. So, I mean, like, yeah, that makes total sense. The invoking the Mesha stele doesn't even really do much. In fact, when I originally did my video on this topic a couple of years ago, I originally included a section of the Mesha stele. And then after reviewing it, I was like, this isn't really relevant because I'm trying to do commentary on 2 Kings 3. Bringing up the Mesha stele is not going to help that much. I'm just going to stick to the commentary. So I actually took that whole section out.
Yeah, well, and that's why in my paper, I try to make interbiblical arguments or intertextual arguments, and just because I'm trying to use the thought world of the authors of Scripture, because that's the best available data that we have to fill in the gaps.
Yeah, it's a Hebrew author. They're writing from a Hebrew perspective. We should look at the other Hebrew texts around. Not saying we're assuming univocality. We're just saying, look, there's similar culture that's going to be better and more relevant for ways to understand 2 Kings 3 for sure.
It's also plausible that the king of Moab is describing some other events. There were probably a number of skirmishes and a number of battles between Moab and Israel in this time period.
But even if it is, it's not relevant to the argument.
Yeah, it's possible, but I don't think that's the case. I think these are describing the same thing.
These two texts are describing the same event. But what we have in 2 Kings 3 seems to be the preservation of a rather embarrassed and reluctant attempt to explain why Moab was.
And this is a part where I actually am sympathetic to. I really do think that this is embarrassing for Israel. And so in this sense, I agree with him. I think this is part of what's going on in the text. It's highly embarrassing. So again, this goes back to the point where I'm not against this video in its totality. There are just important junctures where he goes in a direction that, Drew and I both don't think is necessarily the best explanation given everything that's involved here.
Yeah, it's not embarrassing for Yahweh. It's embarrassing for the Omride dynasty.
Yeah. And I feel like, if the Israelite author wanted to like if it was really understood the way that Chemosh, like the Israelites understood Chemosh defeated them, and the wrath didn't come from Yahweh, this could have easily just been spun by the author. Like they didn't listen to Elisha, they consulted other prophets, and they tried to invoke the wrong deities, and that's really what happened. I mean, like this happens in other places in 1st and 2nd Kings where, the Ahab or one of the kings is just doing something they're not supposed to, and Yahweh gets mad at them. I mean, like, I don't see how this is supposed to be a huge issue for Yahweh. It's an issue for Israel.
Attempt to explain why Moab was able to escape from vassalage to Israel. And they tell this story in a way that gives the reader all kinds of outs, all kinds of ways to say, well, that's understandable. I can see how that would happen. And they seem to not want to be explicit about how they're finally accounting for the expulsion of Israel from Moab by saying, oh, they sacrificed his son on the wall. There was great fury. We took off, which is a very succinct way of hinting at the fact that the God of Moab actually ran Israel out of their nation. And that resulted in the God of Israel failing in their prophecy to hand Moab over to the hands of this Edomite, Israelite, Judahite coalition. And so this story preserves this embarrassing event, and the author of this story seems to have had little other choice but to explain it in as succinct a way as possible, as a matter of the God of that nation running the invading forces off. And
so what are you guys' thoughts on that?
Yeah, so I mean, if that is the case, right, why even include this in the canonical writing? I mean, why? I don't get why they don't have to. I mean, there's lots of gaps in the narrative of 1st and 2nd Kings. I mean, there are years where it's just like this king reigned and that king reigned and so on and so on. I mean, like, why even include the story if that's the case?
I just think that, go ahead, Michael.
Oh, I was going to say, like, this is also probably most likely being written down after the Babylonian exile, when the Babylonians came in with their gods and annexed Jerusalem, took captives back. That would have been a much bigger issue. And they, of course, interpreted it as God's will. Like, but this tiny little 2 Kings 3, they couldn't include that as part of God's will. Like, it just doesn't make sense.
No, I mean, part of the Elijah and Elisha cycles is, I mean, the prophets are right, and the Omride dynasty, especially, but just northern Israelite kings in general are they're apostate. They're going the wrong way. So be more like the prophets, who are true Yahweh followers and not like the kings.
But I would add that this is, I think this is the way that this video ends. I think it's really important to understand how a larger context really demonstrates that this is not the best way to interpret what's going on here. And again, if you just look at this passage, you guys are invoking the logicalness of the logical fallacy of, okay, if this is Chemosh, then this doesn't make sense in light of everything else. And I agree with you on that. But I'm saying that when you look at this in the context of 1 Kings 20 and 1 Kings 22 as well, then you realize that it's not just illogical. It's a part of something even more even more developed, even more nuanced. This is a critique, and this is a targeting of the Omride dynasty's method of operation, particularly in context of warfare. And so this is not the best explanation of this. Not only is it illogical in light of these theological concerns, but when you take it along the trajectory of these other passages, it's not the best sense of the text, even despite of its ambiguity. This is a sacrifice that's being offered because they're trying to remend a fractured political relationship, and that sacrifice demonstrates that the Omrides are more concerned with recreating their political relationships than actually doing what they're told. So of course, Yahweh is going to get ticked off. Of course, the great wrath is going to come from Yahweh. And of course, he's going to chase Israel off. All right. As was what's being said. And Israel then therefore forfeits Moab. So it's when you see it in this larger context, it's not even the best explanation. Well, now how do I put this? There's just a lot better ways to understand this than this is just Chemosh running Israel off.
No, I think you're right. I mean, just like with if you're doing exegesis on any biblical passage, taking it in the abstract is usually not a great idea. And I think your work, Dave, your and Kyle's work, does a great job of framing that context.
Yeah. What do you guys think about why it's so brief? Like, why not expand a little bit more on this and explain why is the author being so brief here?
I think part of it is that there is some ambiguity because you've got, I think, in my opinion at least, you've got a sacrifice being made from both sides. Like the Moabite intention in making the whole burnt offering is one thing, but the Israelite intention in making and joining in on that sacrifice is another because they're the victor. But then I think, with the great wrath, to me, I think that's just assumed that the wrath is God's. So I don't know. I think there's probably some ambiguity just because, from one perspective, the whole burnt offering's seen one way and another perspective, it's another. But I think the other is you just have to do some digging in the rest of the, especially the Deuteronomistic literature, but the Bible as a whole.
I personally think that it's rhetoric. I think that it's more rhetorically powerful to just stop. It's like a mic drop. Because especially if you see this in the context of everything that's been building from 1 Kings 20 into 22, and then now this chapter. All right. And Kyle and I make the argument that these are to be understood together. This is a section, a unit of text that was developed and was written together. It was composed together. And as you understand all of that buildup, and you finally get to this point, and you recognize it's not just Ahab, it's Ahab's descendants that are doing the same thing. Right. And then all of a sudden you're building, and then you see the great wrath from Yahweh gets turned on Israel, and then what happens? They're chased off and they return home, and then it's done. It's almost as if there's a rhetorical value there to it's a full stop, and then you as the reader is left to chew on that. So I think it's intentional. I think that it works with all the ambiguity, and it's kind of this crescendo mic drop moment that just says, and that's all we're going to say about this.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think that's a great point. And yeah, again, I think you're right. It just fits in with a larger context of 2 Kings. What are you going to do at the end of the day? It's at the end of the day, I think one of the best points that Drew makes in his paper, and you do as well, David, is that this is a Yahwistic author. Is he really going to be writing this? He could have spun this any way he wanted. I think the mic drop understanding is a good way to understand it. Looking at it in its full context, it just makes far more sense. So yeah, at the end of the day, I don't think this is good evidence that the Israelite authors are admitting that some god Chemosh defeated Yahweh, especially if they're writing after the Babylonian exile. That would have been given much more credit to someone like Marduk, but that's not the way they interpreted that exiles. Why would they have interpreted that here in this tiny brief passage of 2 Kings 3?
Yeah, I mean, in the exiles, I mean, really isn't that just the cycle of the Deuteronomistic history is that God's faithful, the people are failing, and at the end, I mean, you've got a punishment for that faithlessness, which is Deuteronomy. I mean, that's what Deuteronomy warns about before the people enter the land. I mean, that's really what it's all about.
Yeah, we'll get to some super chats in a minute. I do have one question for you guys. What do you think about the themes of Exodus in 2 Kings 3? So this is something Peter J. Lightheart has noted, is that like God miraculously provides water, a song is played, water leads to destruction. There's a theme of water and blood. There's the death of the firstborn. Mesha might be a combination of Moses and Joshua. And like that's like a clue that the author is saying, like, just as Yahweh was in control that time in a foreign land, he's also in control in this foreign land. Do you guys think there's anything there, or do you think that Lightheart's going too far? What are your thoughts?
I don't personally think that he's going too far. I think that the thing that I would say is about the Exodus is such a pervasive concept, and this is, this is also an argument for its historicity, at least on some level. It's really difficult to see the pervasiveness of an event just appear everywhere and be behind so many curtains if it was historical fabrication or literary fiction. It's really hard for me. I mean, that's a lot of buy-in. That's a lot of communal buy-in for it to be so pervasive. So I think it's possible, and I think it speaks to the fact that this event has just oozes from their assessment of their experiences. It's just in the water, as they say, and it's just constantly being referred to, sometimes more explicitly than others, but it's always there. And anything that they can, anytime that they can pull it in to help make sense of a new event, I think they do it.
Yeah, I think that's well put, Dave. Jan Osman talks about the memory of the Exodus, right? I mean, he never goes so far as to talk about the historicity, as far as I know, but he wants to talk about the memory, and there certainly is a very strong memory of the Exodus. And I can't say if it's a conscious retelling, kind of in the frame of Exodus. But like you said, Dave, I mean, at the very least, it pervades their mentality. In the same way, I mean, you look at. So this is part of First and Second Kings, or part of the Deuteronomistic literature related to Deuteronomy. And Deuteronomy itself is the second law. That's what Deuteronomy means, as an interpretation on partly, at least Deuteronomy 12 through 26 is reinterpretation of the covenant code in Exodus. So I mean, you're constantly riffing on that theme of the Exodus. So I could see that certainly in this literature as well. I hadn't given that a whole lot of thought, though. Is that in his Brazos commentary?
Yeah.
Okay. Yeah, that's a great commentary.
Yeah.
Really
Yeah, I cited a little bit in my video I did where I relied mostly on your paper, Drew. It's linked below if anyone's interested. And I brought up some of Lightheart's stuff as well to just add some more weight to it all. So, yeah, I just always thought that was kind of interesting. And his point is it's a perverted Exodus.
Yeah, it's quite possible. Again, I think the memory or the event, however you want to put it, I'm okay with talking about the event of the Exodus. It has just been so entrenched in their minds that it just oozes from everything that they do.
Yeah, for sure. All right, we'll get to some super chats here. Thank you for becoming a channel member. Thank you as well, Maya. Much appreciated. Cole Crocodile says we need an inspiring philosophy versus redeemed Zoomer, Molinism versus Calvinism debate. You cook them, though. I appreciate that, but I try not to debate Christians too much. I prefer to focus on unity. But yeah, I'm not a Calvinist for sure. How does the New Testament authors' knowledge of cultural and geographical facts about the first century Judea make them reliable eyewitnesses to Jesus's life? Well, you can check out my series on gospel reliability. The first thing I'd say is it doesn't prove they are. It buffers it. It helps support if they're getting facts about geography, right? Like John does extensively. It's circumstantial evidence that he does know a lot about the region and is likely from there, and it's likely that he was getting so many facts right because he's reporting real stories. That's what I would say.
And you can make an argument too for the Old Testament there. All the geographic notations. This is a little bit more complicated, but there's a lot of geographic value in the Old Testament.
Yeah, like the Topidins and Exodus when P. Ramesses, you got Belsaphan.
Yeah. And there's all sorts of them. Yep.
Yeah. How do you respond to someone saying that since Deuteronomy 20:10-11 is a shall command rather than a case law, that doesn't fall under the Matthew 19 rule? Well, let me put that up here. So Deuteronomy 20, and I'll just read it for you guys. So what are we at? 20 and 11. So 10 and 11, sorry. When you draw near to a city to fight against it, offer it terms of peace, and if it responds to you peacefully and opens up to you, then all the people who are found in it shall be forced to do labor for you and shall serve you. But it makes no peace with you, make war against it, then you shall besiege it. So I'm not sure what you're getting at. You might be referencing like something I've said in an older series, which is that Matthew 19, when Jesus says the law of divorce is given because your hearts were hard, that the Torah was not ideal. It was sort of given like as a compromise with Israel because it allowed like things like law of divorce, even though God didn't really want that. I don't think that works here, Sean, because if you read like Dilbert Hillers or John Walton, for example, these are still like, first of all, these are applying to Israel in Canaan. These are not laws that are meant to apply to Christians outside of any sort of land, but it's also still just teaching judicial wisdom and just the language of the day and the context they use.
Yeah, you really do need, anytime you get into legal codes, you got to lean on people who understand how legal codes function. Drew and I have had many conversations about this. They're more like wisdom lists than anything else. And that alters your paradigm of how you think. And it's really difficult. I mentioned to you before we came on air about teaching a class just the other week. And we got into this because it was a class on Matthew. You've really got to understand how legal speak worked in the ancient world, and it's totally different.
Yeah, it's not a code like we think of a law code that is enforced by a central authority. There's typically a higher standard involved there, like an ideal.
Even Raymond Westbrook has written on this as well.
Yeah, of course, he's written on everything.
Yeah. To the scholars, thoughts on bara in Genesis 1? I guess they mean, what do you think the word means?
I totally get where we're going now. This is anything goes, right?
They will put in, you name it, some crazy stuff. I'll get like some weird ones, like I'll get stuff like, "Is my pet in heaven right now?" I'm like, I don't know. I'm not.
Yeah, it's good. I don't think bara, the verb, is the most important thing. I think it's, how do you understand Bereshit bara, Elohim Bereshit? I think that's the most intriguing aspect to that. In the beginning, or when God began, the NRSV seems to kind of lump everything together when I think it translates it when God began, or when in the beginning, or in the beginning when God began to create, or something crazy. Yeah. So it takes the two options and it just mushes them together, and it's just like, we're not even going to deal with the issues here. So I don't think bara is the most interesting aspect to that verse. I think it's Bereshit, the first word. Yeah.
What is the best way to learn Greek? Right now, I'm reading a book called An Introduction to the New Testament Greek by Hubert Drumright.
Study. That's the best way to learn it. Study.
Yeah.
Keep
Lots
reading.
Of repetition. It's like math. To me, learning the biblical languages is like math. You just have to practice it and practice it and practice it. Yeah. There's no
get a nice set of vocab words and flashcards and just take them with you everywhere.
Yeah.
There you go. That's the way to do it. This is a question for me. Hey, IP, I agree with you on all except the idea that only the Father has a deity. Will my beliefs pose a problem, or is it still compatible with Christianity? So, well, you have to agree with me on everything, or you're not saved. That's a rule, obviously. That's obviously the case. I mean, no, you can argue that. I don't think that's supported in Scripture. I think it's very clear that Jesus and the Holy Spirit proceed, or is begotten of the Father. And Jesus says, like, he can't. All his authority was given to him from the Father. Everything, he can't do anything apart from the Father, as he says in John 5. So he's very much saying, like, all my being is in the Father. In John, he says that the Father is his God. So that's why I become a monarchical Trinitarian in that regard. So, yeah, I mean, no, you can disagree, but I would just argue against you via Scripture. But I mean, that doesn't mean that still sounds like you're affirming Nicene Christianity. So you're fine. Like, I don't see the issue there. Is Than kicked off the stream when VIPs come on? Yeah, I keep Than off the streams when I got really important, smart people on, so he doesn't embarrass me. Drew and David, Than is like my co-host. Yeah, Than is like my co-host. He's on with a lot of streams. And sometimes I'm like, I already have two people on. You can sit this one out, focus on some other stuff. But he'll be on tomorrow night. We're responding to some atheists. So he'll be on tomorrow. Don't worry. This is a fascinating topic. We'll have to rematch. I think he meant rewatch. So thank you, John. Please rewatch.
I mean, we're up for a fight too if you want another match.
Yeah.
I'm sure. Yeah. I'm nominating IP for the new Pope. That's great. I'm definitely in the running. I've been contacted by a couple cardinals now. So, sure enough, we'll
Is that white smoke behind you?
Yeah. Yeah, I wish. No. Appreciate it. I don't think I'm going to get the new Pope hat though. Some people learn that the wrath of Yahweh is that Yahweh doesn't do anything but removes his presence, so that calamity can occur. Seems unlikely from an ancient reader perspective. So I think the question here is like, wrath of Yahweh just means he removes his presence.
No, I don't.
True or not?
Drew. No, I can't remember all the specific references off the top of my head, but often it's, he sends a pestilence or disease, some sort. It's usually what the wrath entails.
Yeah, just have them read Deuteronomy 28 and all the curses that's way more than just removing the presence so that calamity could occur. I mean, I guess you could make a backdoor argument that but no, I think the Bible, I think the Old Testament is pretty clear, particularly just in looking at the language from a grammatical standpoint. The Lord is the subject of a lot of verbs that imply sending of things and doing things and that sort of stuff. He's a very active, he's not just removing himself. Now there are times where it seems to be the case, but that we can't boil it down to that.
Yeah, I totally agree. There are definitely times it seems the case, but yeah, it's not always so. So as you were saying about questions being off topic, here's one. Pardon me, gentlemen, if this is off topic, but out of curiosity, what are your immediate thoughts on perspectives concerning Joseph Smith's Book of Abraham and his claims regarding Reformed Egyptian? Now, you guys obviously are well versed on this, so dive in.
I'm just going to go ahead and say that I think anything by Joseph Smith and the claims by Joseph Smith are debatable.
Yeah,
that's very diplomatically put, Dave.
Yes, are debatable.
Egyptologist David Falk was on, I think, like 2 or 3 weeks ago. We looked at a video on the Book of Abraham and all the problems with it. And yeah, it's a disaster. It's an absolute disaster. So yeah. Who takes Dan seriously? Asked Tyrone. Well, we do. Which I'm responding to him. I mean, sure.
Well, look, that's a very interesting point. Who takes Dan seriously? A lot of people do. And he's a widely influential voice. And again, just so that everybody understands, I'm not, complete anti Dan McClellan. I just think that in many instances, I just disagree with his interpretation. And this is an instance to where I think the error is an oversimplification of the possibilities. And the other part of it is when you understand this chapter in the context of what I think the context is, it's really not the best interpretation given all that we know. So, it is way more nuanced than what he implies. And I think, as I've already said, when you start digging, it's his ultimate idea that Chemosh is the God that sends the great wrath is highly questionable.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And yeah, I've not read that paper. I don't have time to read everything. And from a physicist, it's my arguments are philosophical. So they tend to see a lot of scientists get a lot of things wrong when it comes to philosophy. Can we count low church Protestants as Christians with Ignatius' letter to the Ephesians 20:22 saying the Eucharist is medicine of immortality? I don't think that's the exact reference, but yes, we can, because they affirm Nicene Christianity. I don't think that would disclude them, especially since Ignatius is a church father and not canon. So yeah, I think low church Protestants are Christians for sure. I don't even see why we would dispute that. But yeah. Do you ever plan to discuss whether or not the Apostle Paul is promoting dispassionate sex in 1 Thessalonians 4:4-5? McClellan has a video on it. Now I'll read the verse. Okay, I'll start in verse 3. For this is the will of God, your sanctification, that you abstain from sexual immorality, that each of you know how to control his own body in holiness and honor, not in the passion of lust like the Gentiles who do not know God. I don't know what McClellan has said about this. I don't think Paul at all was promoting dispassionate sex in that. Like, so sex without passion, I guess.
I don't know how that's possible, but
these questions are great.
I know. So not in the. I mean, like in 1 Corinthians 7, Paul says, like, do not deprive one another, like, unless you're burning with, like, he says, don't get married unless you're burning with passion. So obviously, passion in marriage is okay if you read 1 Corinthians 7. I don't think that's what Paul will be promoting here, and I've not seen McClellan's video on that. But now I'm very curious and want to find it.
Sounds like the next watch.
Dispassionate sex. What is that even? Are you ever going to make a video about whether or not Isaiah 40 to 60s was written during or after the Babylonian captivity? Yeah, maybe.
Oh, Dave, I know who you need on this one.
I don't know if I have strong opinions, but yeah, that's an interesting.
We have a certain professor, I think it would be great to argue this one, but
no, he would not do well on this platform.
No.
That's fine. Who?
It's Oswald.
Oh,
John Oswald.
Oh, okay. All right. Yeah, I knew that name.
He's written he wrote the Nikon. So he has very strong views of authorship in Isaiah, and we've had numerous conversations with him on this and that sort of thing. It's a very complex issue, as your audience probably understands, and I know you understand, Michael. But it's a robust conversation. It's a difficult conversation.
Yeah. What does he come down on? Like, what is his?
He's single authorship.
Oh, really?
He's single author. Yeah, he is. He was. He still is. And he's one of the few that continue to hold the single authorship. But in his Nikon commentary, he lays it all out. I think the trendy, edgy thing about his position, and he wrote this decades ago. He hasn't deviated from his position, essentially, as far as I can tell. Is that the edginess is that how does it go? That Isaiah was writing as if he was in these. It wasn't just straight. It was predictive prophecy, but there's a particular. I'm butchering it, but yes, I'll just stop there and I'll just say that he still is single authorship. So Isaiah wrote all the from chapter 40 on through 66. It was still Isaiah. And it was the 8th century prophet.
Yeah, and I think he is willing to say that some of Isaiah's later apprentices, or whoever would write down things that he said in a later generation, but it was still, at the very least, the vox of Isaiah.
Thank you, sir. He says, Mr. IP, you've helped my faith, and I love your videos about Easter not being pagan. Keep the good work. Well, thank you very much. Much appreciated. You mentioned you're coming to Brisbane. Where can I find out more? So yeah, we just announced an event. I just announced it on Facebook, but Questioning Christianity is an organization that's bringing me down to Australia in Brisbane. What are the dates? I'm coming in May. I'll be there like the 14th to the 21st. And we're doing a bunch of events. Like, there's a pub event. I'll be there with, like, the physicist Luke Barnes, for example. And we'll be doing a bunch of other stuff. So check out Questioning Christianity. They're going to be announcing stuff. I already announced the first event on my Facebook page. So facebook.com/inspiring philosophy. You can see where that is. So yeah, hope you come out, Dave. But yeah, that should be happening pretty soon. I already have the ticket and everything. So it's like the 14th, and then I fly back to the States on the 21st. And then I will be in London the next month. I'll be in London for a conference, but also I'll be on Unbelievable like the 3rd and 4th for 2 events, 2 debates, conversations kind of thing. So I don't know if they've announced those yet, but that should be, I think, June 3rd and 4th, unless something happens. But yeah, so busy stuff. I'm doing a lot of international travel as of late. So yeah, hopefully you check those guys out. To the scholars, early or late date of Daniel? Real quick, this is obviously an easy answer. Obviously,
I'm a late date. I'm a late date Daniel. I'm a late date Daniel guy.
I am too.
Yeah, I don't see that as too much of an issue. I think it was
no, but
you know.
Yeah, no, but so there are a lot of people who think it is an issue.
Yeah, I know, but I think it has reliable traditions. I know Benjamin Noonan has written on this about some of the language in there being very old, from an earlier Persian period or even older. But I mean, I think a lot of these stuff were like you could have like reliable aspects in there that just compiled later, like during the time of Antiochus Epiphanes IV. So that's generally where I fall on it. So there you have it, guys. Reliable but late, which is perfectly fine. So anything you guys want to say before we close this out? You guys actually wrote a book together called Silhouettes of Scripture.
So you're gonna do that?
I've not had a chance to read it yet, but yeah, I remember. I noticed you guys wrote a book like last year.
Wow, it's a lot cheaper than it used to be, and it's still $87. No, yeah, Dave is a great friend of mine. He and I went through the same doctoral program, but at different times, and we actually connected. He had long since graduated, and then we met actually at a conference, and we connected on this concept that became, we actually both presented on different papers, and we're like, hey, we should write a book together, and we just had a great working relationship then, and I just love Dave to death. He's been a great colleague and a great friend.
Yeah, it's about comparative studies. Drew and I do a lot of comparative studies together, so it's comparing like texts and looking at similarities and differences and trying to figure out what a good comparison could particularly add to our understanding of kind of the worldview and that sort of stuff. So we compared different texts with non-biblical texts. Drew even went so far as to compare the Song of Solomon to a Red Hot Chili Pepper song, which was very innovative and actually very interesting. But it hinges upon this idea of comparative method and contextual approach and that sort of stuff. And so, it was a lot of fun. We did a lot of different things, and each chapter was written by a different person, and so, it was a lot of fun.
Yeah. I love questions like this. What is the best quick explanation of theistic evolution if you're asked in a casual conversation? Oh yeah, quick and easy. It depends on what they're asking and what aspect. See my Genesis 1-11 series. See my video, Was Evolution Inevitable? Because it depends on what they're asking specifically. I don't know if there's going to be
that's. Or if you want to hear some musings on that, you can buy my new book. So I just So I talk about a little bit of that and kind of give my own development through that whole process and where I am right now and how I, kind of moved and where I in that whole process of that sort of thing. So,
what's the title of that again?
Frigate Birds, Sea Lions, and Darwin.
Nice. That's a nice.
Yeah.
Title. You always have good books for titles. Like Ahab's House of Horrors. Like it's pretty good. Yeah, so
well, it's got to sell. It's got to pop.
Excellent. So
we're such big sellers, aren't we, Dave?
Yeah, we are. We're huge sellers. NT Wright, move over.
Yeah.
Yeah, you'll be there one day. Don't worry. You got to keep writing. You'll get there. Yeah.
Yeah, I doubt it.
Appreciate you guys coming on. And I think we can say when it comes to 2 Kings 3, we should not say that anyone has a definitive answer on it because it's just a vague passage. And we should stay away from such like dogmatic stances on that. It's a vague passage. I know Joel Correcto is going to be doing a video soon arguing for a nuanced approach to this as well. David Falk's in the chat. He has another way to read this. There's just a lot of different ways to read this passage. And, the idea that it's definitive God was defeated is not a good approach. I think that's the least likely of all the interpretations out there. So
I would say that it's highly, the whole Chemosh is the great wrath guy. Ultimately, I'm not a fan of that particular conclusion. That ranks down on the list of most viable, in my opinion.
For sure. So, all right. Anything else you guys want to say, or can we close this out and get out of here?
I'm good.
Be done yapping? Excellent. Well, it was nice having you both on. Hope to have you guys on again sometime. Again, I'll be live tomorrow on my channel with Than, and we're going to have Redeem Zoomer back on. We're going to be responding to a video from Genetically Modified Skeptic about how the right is using a sinister plan to trick Gen Z men. And so we're going to be responding to that from a Christian perspective without getting too political, if at all. So
Sounds
we'll
awesome.
be back tomorrow live. Yeah. Excellent. So thanks for coming, everyone.
right.
See you guys next time. You made it to the end of this video, which means this message matters to you. If you want to see more content like this reaching people for Christ, you can help make it happen. Your support makes these videos possible. Click the link below and donate today. And if you want to go even deeper, consider joining our Patreon community. You'll get early access to videos, behind-the-scenes content, and a place to connect with others passionate about this mission.